Welcome to the Polymer Science Podcast. I am Dr. Alicia Burtis.
And I'm Jacob Shackman.
In this podcast, we'll be speaking to researchers from around the world and talk to them about how their work is improving our daily lives. I hope you enjoy our conversation and that you learn something new.
Hello and welcome back, my favorite Polymer Science Podcast fans. Man, it's been way too long, hasn't it? My name is Dr. Jacob Morales Sheckman. Yeah, I guess we have got to do some editing in that intro there. It's been such a long time. A couple things have changed. One being I have a pretty cool prefix to my name now. I can actually even be a suffix if we want. It's a versatile title, right? Anyways, I'm excited to have finished that journey. If you're looking to hire a PhD in polymer science and engineering with a focus on investigating structure-property relationships, please reach out to PolymerSciencePodcast@gmail.com. Wow, a little bit of self-advertising there, but in other, more exciting news, we are back on the show. I'm sorry it's taken this long. Life has kind of taken over, I suppose, for the better, but here we are. I have an exciting interview today with Dr. Kevin Wyss. I actually recorded this interview with Dr. Kevin Wyss last year, over a year ago. And since then, he has successfully defended his PhD. He did so last August at Rice University. And now he's a chemist at a global oil and gas company known as Schlumberger. Schlumberger. I'm sure I got one of those three correct. I feel pretty confident in that. Regardless, he is now putting his amazing skills to use. And it's so easy for me to hype up my guest, but really you'll see during his tenure as a graduate student at Rice University, he worked on some really, really exciting things. Notably, of course, the ever-growing polymer upcycling. But he also developed a method known as Flash-Joule heating, where he takes plastic ash waste to generate high-strength graphene. And by high-strength, I mean this competes better than any industrial standard and is produced at a lower cost. So, with that said, let's get into the show. Oh, actually, I want to note that you'll notice it's a little raw cut, a little unedited early on in this episode. And that's because I felt that I kind of wanted to make it a little bit more personable for my intros rather than the cut and dry read off of my script here. So I hope you enjoy that. If you have any feedback or comments or questions in general about the show, we're always trying to improve. So please reach out at PolymerSciencePodcast@gmail.com. And with that, I hope you enjoy the show.
There we go. This is Cannoli. So we've had her about 4 years.
Yeah.
So
Is Cannoli's
when we started grad school, so
perfect. The perfect stress reliever is such a cute dog.
Yeah.
Wow.
So yeah, really just love walking her.
Yeah.
Being outside, staying active. So it has helped a lot.
Is she a border collie? What kind of dog is she?
We got her DNA tested, and they were like, "Oh, she's part corgi and part pit bull," and we're like, "What?" So
whoa.
I don't know if they like mixed her sample up in the lab or something. But yeah, I usually think that she's like an Australian Shepherd or a border collie or something. But we adopted her, so we don't really know for sure. So
yeah, that's the best way to do it, man.
Yeah.
All right, so I'm all set here. The way this will start out, I'm gonna read my little intro that I typed out. And then, like I told you briefly in one of my recent LinkedIn messages, I'm gonna start, with just like a little bit of your history, where you're from, where you grew up, how you started getting into research and materials science, your academic background, and then we'll start getting into the research that you're doing now. Definitely, we're not going to get too technical. Although I think I said it's only going to be a bit on upcycling. The more I looked at your work and the use of this plastic ash waste, that's so amazing. So we're going to have to talk about that more than I anticipated.
Perfect.
Which, yeah, it's great.
That's fine.
So yeah, let's go ahead and get this started. All right, podcast voice. Hello and welcome oh, that's a little loud on my end. 1 second. Let me turn that down. Testing. All right. Hello. Hello and welcome everyone to the Polymer Science Podcast. My name is Jacob Scheckman, and today my guest is Rice University PhD candidate Kevin. And Kevin, I'm reading this. I didn't ask how to pronounce your last name yet. Is it
Kevin Wyss? Yeah,
Kevin
most people say Wyss, but it's actually Wyss. It really doesn't matter though.
Okay. Well, you told me Wyss, so I'm going to say Wyss. Today, my guest is Rice University PhD candidate Kevin Wyss. Kevin is an NSF graduate research fellow focusing his efforts on the production of organic and inorganic materials for their green, scalable applications in composites, energy storage, and catalysis. And Kevin was actually the first person to reach out to me directly to inquire about being on the podcast. And honestly, folks, that's all the flattery it takes to make this sort of thing happen. So thank you so much for being here today, Kevin. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Yeah, it's great to be here. I saw your first one of your episodes with, I think it was someone from Dow that does upcycling.
Yeah. Shoot, I'll have to go back and remember. We've done quite a few upcycling projects now. I'd have to go through the list.
They were part of the Bottle Consortium.
Oh, that's Dr. Katrina Knauer.
Yeah. And actually, during COVID, to pass the time, I was working with my boss to actually apply for that same grant, and we didn't actually get funded for it. But they funded a bunch of really great projects on polymer upcycling and increased recyclability and sustainability. So I actually saw her and I was like, wow. And then I listened to some of the episodes and said, wow, this is a really great type of podcast. So
awesome. I very much appreciate it. Thank you. It's been a lot of fun doing this, getting to meet new people, getting to talk about these cool science, and people like yourself. You have an impressive academic background, so I'm excited to talk to you about what the work that you're doing today and see what you're getting into. When was the first time you heard about this show? Do you know?
I actually was at the ACS national meeting in Chicago, and I think you were just walking around handing out your business cards.
I was.
So then I got a bunch of business cards at the ACS meeting, and I just went on LinkedIn like the next week and just, connected with a bunch of the people that I thought were interesting. And you were on there. And so then I started seeing about the podcast. And then I saw that one person that you brought on talking about upcycling and the Bottle Consortium. And then I said, wow. And then I went and listened to some of them and said, this is my kind of thing. So
awesome. That makes me happy to hear, man. So tell us about yourself. Where are you from? Where did you grow up? Let's start there. Let's start, aside from the science.
Yeah, so I grew up in Albuquerque, New Mexico, so in the Southwest. My dad actually works at Sandia National Labs as an engineer, so I've kind of had STEM my whole life. I kind of got really into chemistry when I took AP Chemistry, had a great teacher, and some of us in our AP Chemistry class convinced him to teach the next semester kind of like an organic biochem entry-level class. So the first semester of, I think my junior year of high school was kind of basic organic chemistry, and then biochemistry after that. So that really, because when you're taking AP chemistry, you're not really learning how the world works.
Sure.
You're learning heats of formation and thermodynamics and ice melting and stuff like that. But when I took organic and biochemistry, that was kind of explaining more how the world works, how chemistry can really be applicable. And so then I really loved that. Started doing some summer research at Sandia National Labs because it was right in town over the
while
summer.
You were in high school?
Yeah. So kind of my dad helped me kind of get in touch with some people, and my AP chemistry teacher helped me also. And so from there, I ended up at Auburn University. I got recruited to run track there. So moved from the Southwest to the Southeast in Alabama. And then after that, I met my now fiance. And so she's in dental school and I'm in grad school. So at Auburn, we applied to 10 programs, and then it lined up to go to Rice. So it was really just a bunch of chance to kind of end up here at Rice now.
Yeah.
But,
it's interesting you comment on, when you're taking AP chemistry. I like that comment. You're not necessarily learning about the world yet and how it works. When did you start to make that transition into realizing that you enjoy research activities? And maybe it wasn't even deep in material science or chemistry at the time, but at some point, right, once we find an interest in science and we start looking at life a little bit differently and trying to answer questions of how things works. So when do you think you started to make that transition?
Yeah, I think it was in my later high school, in that summer between senior year and then freshman year of college, when I was working at Sandia National Lab, we were making some pretty basic organic ligands, and complexing them with these transition metals and seeing, can we catalyze reactions, or can we use them as these fluorescent labels and things like that. So we were making these conjugated organic ligands and then complexing them and then characterizing them. And so I was really just basically doing some pretty basic, green yard reagents and things like that. And then from there, IR, things like that, like pretty basic stuff.
Sure.
And then that was my first really exposure to research, I think. And then from there, that professor or researcher at Sandia helped connect me with someone at Auburn a couple years later.
Yeah.
And so I was doing more of the same stuff. I didn't transition into materials until I got to Wyss.
Okay.
So I was really just working on making these coordination compounds for fluorescence or catalysis or, small organometallic compounds.
Yeah.
And then when I got to Wyss,
well, before we get to your Wyss work, let's talk a little bit about that Auburn. Even though it may not be materials or polymer science there yet, but tell us about it. What was some of the questions you were trying to answer, and what are the big picture purposes?
Yeah. So at Auburn, I got connected with Dr. Ann Gordon. She's now at Texas Tech. But there we were making these coordination compounds we would design these ligands that would bind to lanthanides and actinides. And so in terms of actinides, uranium, thorium, if there is a radioactive spill, like the Fukushima earthquake, you might have a nuclear reactor compromised, or if there's a dirty bomb or something, then a lot of times they'll test the water, for example, for uranium content using ICP-MS, or, pretty large instruments that are not very mobile if you wanted to go into the field. And so we were trying to design these ligands that would selectively bind to the actinides and then fluoresce. So it was like a turn on, turn off detector,
Yeah.
You can think like that. So maybe eventually it could be applied into like a pH paper type thing where you dip it in the water, see if there's actinide contamination or things like that. So we never got that far. We were really just designing these ligands. How can you make it competitively bind just the actinides instead of all the transition metals or other things that are, in a realistic waste stream or water system. So it was a lot of, organic chemistry to design the ligands and then coordinate in lanthanides and actinides and then do the fluorescence testing, the colorimetric UV vis, stuff like that. So it was more organic chemistry, coordination chemistry. We used some of those same ligands to make, copper catalysts and stuff like that. So it was kind of cool to make the compounds, characterize them, and sometimes apply them in catalysis as well.
Yeah, that's exciting that you got to go through the full process here and there of design to application and see how it works.
Yeah, and that's something that I thought would kind of carry over more into kind of all of science.
Sure.
And in undergrad, I really wanted to go into pharmaceutical chemistry. And so then I realized that kind of looking more into it, and I did a semester in a pharmaceutical lab at Auburn. There's just so much, I like that I'm able to see it through all the steps, make, characterize, apply. And that's kind of what I do now also. But in pharmaceutical, with the whole biology, the whole cells, eventually in vitro testing, all that. So if you're a pharmaceutical chemist, you're really just making it. And so,
right.
And it can take 20 years for a drug target to, be realized and things like that. So
sure.
That's why I didn't end up going into that and stayed more on, more organic, organometallic chemistry.
Yeah.
Undergrad.
What was different in your different regarding what it felt like to do research when you transitioned from Sandia to, as a high school student, which still, that's crazy and impressive, to research at Sandia to research as an undergraduate at Auburn? What felt different about those experiences?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. At Sandia, I was only there for one summer. It was a little more structured, I think, because you're there for a summer, you can go and work 9 to 5 or whatever. Whereas when you're trying to do undergraduate research, you have a busy schedule. And then I was a student athlete too. So then it was just like, man, my time is kind of like, I got to get in the lab when I can get in there and kind of being inconsistent. And I think a lot of, both at Sandia, I had a really great mentor that kept it really structured. And he really designed kind of a whole curriculum, it felt like, of, this is how you make stuff. This is how you characterize stuff. He didn't get anything out of me, right? As kind of a one summer high school student. But I really got a lot out of kind of his mentorship, and I still keep in touch with him. And then at Auburn, I had a really great grad student that I was paired up with, that really helped me, and we worked together for probably 2.5, 3 years. So it was really, getting, I guess, lucky with mentorship, because especially, we're there now can be very accessible to mentorship, especially at, middle career or late career and things like that. So
yeah, 100%. It's case by case basis when it comes to that sort of thing,
and even day by day for me.
Yeah, and actually I was going to add, right, sometimes there might be a summer this senior graduate student gets paired with an undergraduate student, but senior grad student wants to graduate soon. They have many other priorities. It just kind of becomes difficult to give this undergraduate everything that they need. So day by day also works, but I get that. So now you're working in the Dr. James Tour group. That's correct?
That is correct. Yeah. And
okay. Yeah. You're at Rice University. Wow. What made you get into this group?
Yeah. So I came to Rice thinking that I would keep doing the same thing, transition metal, organometallic chemistry, maybe some catalysis, things like that. And then when, the first week orientation for us was just all the PIs come and give a presentation, right? And so I saw his work and I was like, wow, this is really incredible. He works a lot with graphene, carbon nanotubes. So these carbon nanomaterials that are super strong, conductive, high value. And he was just showing the work that I've been working on for my whole PhD. They had just kind of discovered it. And so I could see that, we can make these really valuable carbon nanomaterials that have a ton of applications. He was showing that we can make them at scale and out of trash and, out of very low cost starting materials, really efficient green methods. And so when I saw his presentation, and he's a very good pitchman, I guess, he really sells his work very well. I came out of that meeting and I was like, wow, this is really going to change kind of the field and, have a bunch of opportunity, both, personally and career trajectory wise. It's just kind of opening this whole new area of research, basically. And there was going to be a bunch of, papers I could tell and a bunch of really cool work. So I said, even though I have no materials experience, I really wanted to join that group. And so that was 2019. And then, when I first joined that group, I felt a lot behind, because I was in there with material scientists and people that, kind of understood, materials and materials characterization and things like that. But then COVID happened and I really just used that time to get familiar with the literature, the techniques, things like that. So that was, I guess, sitting at home, not in lab, a good use of time for a first year grad student. So
exactly. It's that first year. It's hard to do research. You kind of have no idea what you're doing, right? Yep. So that worked out, and that's good that you were able to take advantage of that time because during COVID, it was really easy to sit at home and not be productive. So good on you. And so the name of this type of research, I don't know if it's what I'm saying it right, but it's Flash-Joule heating. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. And so it's kind of a fancy sounding name, but if we think about Joule heating, that is just how our toasters or curling irons work, right? We're passing current through a resistor and we make heat, right? And if in the case of a toaster, we're waiting for that heat to transfer from our heating coil to our bread to toast our bread, right? Mm-hmm. So what we do with our Joule heating is instead of waiting for that slow heat transfer step, like in an oven or a tube furnace, things like that, we are actually passing the current directly through our sample or our feedstock. And so we're generating the heat right in that resistor, that sample. Usually it's a powder, like we can think of charcoal. Charcoal is somewhat conductive. We can basically pass current through it and get, very efficient, fast heating. Since we don't have, we're generating the heat right there. We don't have to wait for that slow heat transfer to kind of toast our bread, right? We have that heat and energy right in that feedstock, right where it needs to be. So we can get very high temperatures, up to like 3000 Kelvin. So like very hot within, 100 milliseconds, just because we're making the heat right there. And so all that energy we're putting in the form of heat is able to, do chemical reactions, whatever. Generally, this work first started turning, charcoal or similar carbon materials into graphene, that super valuable nanomaterial that has had like a lot of research done on it. And so a lot of lab scale research because it's so expensive, it's hard to make scalably. And so we showed that we can really convert coal, charcoal, even waste products into graphene using this very simple, relatively method. It doesn't use any solvents, it doesn't use any catalysts, doesn't use any inert gases. So we're really just applying this heat, and it's over such a short time period that instead of going all the way to graphite, where we have stacks of graphene sheets, we're able to kind of kinetically trap it as that graphene product. And so since then, we first started on a 10 milligram scale, and then we went to a gram scale, and now we're up to a kilogram scale.
To give us an idea of what these scales sort of look like. What if I were to hold 10 milligrams of something in my hand? What does that look like?
Maybe like a small allergy pill or something, type size. And then a gram of graphene would be, let's see, maybe like half a cotton ball, maybe.
Okay.
In term, compressed down. And then what we do is we put it in these little tubes. We put our charcoal in the tube. We seal it with the kind of electrodes, which we deliver the current through. We have it hooked up to this circuitry, which we kind of made in the lab. And then we discharge the current. And so then we just, extrude the powder out of the tube. And then that's our graphene product. So it's very fast. And a kilogram would be maybe like a tub of ice cream type, size. And so then once we have the graphene, we've used it in all kinds of applications. Composites is the main one. If you add 0.1% of graphene to cement, so 1 gram per kilogram of cement, it gets 35% stronger, right? So to build the same building, you use...
Wait. What was that ratio of graphene to cement again?
So 0.1%
0.1% graphene.
0.1 weight percent, you get a 35% increase in compressive strength usually.
Wow, that's incredible.
Right.
So I have a couple of questions. First, what molecularly, to help people again get an idea, what is graphene, right? What does that look like, and how does it differ from just a piece of lead or pencil lead or charcoal?
Right, yeah. So graphite is actually stacks of graphene, but if we look at that just one stack of graphene, we have these carbons, and each carbon is bonded to 3 other carbons, kind of like a benzene ring. If we have a bunch of benzene rings neighboring each other. So it's kind of like a honeycomb. If you can picture a honeycomb, we have those hexagons all next to each other, all interconnected. And so because we have that sp2 hybridization throughout the entire sheet, we have something that's very strong because we have those kind of double bonds throughout the entire sheet. It's very thin. It's only 1 atom thick, but we can stretch that graphene sheet onto up to, not our work. Our work makes pretty small sheets, but people have been able to make graphene sheets the size of like a TV. And so that's one of the applications people, 1 sheet of graphene is very conductive. It's also see-through. And so if we can make flexible electronics or things like that, that normally use other materials as that conductive layer or touchscreen layer, if we can make it out of this single layer flexible graphene, then we can have, flexible electronics or transparent electronics, things like that. So that's one of, graphene is actually won the Nobel Prize for its discovery in the mid 2000s. And so since then, in the past really almost 20 years, people have used graphene in everything because it's super light, super strong, very conductive. It's pretty heat resistant, chemically resistant. So it's really, people call it like a wonder material because people have used it in so many different things, whether it's batteries or composites or even like water or gas filters, things like that.
It seems like also if able to produce properly for any given application, it compared to whatever we have currently, it is a wonder material. Yeah, and that's really what has held it back. Is we can either to make those really big sheets of graphene, people use chemical vapor deposition. So basically, they make this 1 sheet of graphene on a piece of usually very clean copper or some sort of catalyst, and you're literally building that graphene sheet atom by atom. Basically, you flow gas over this copper sheet, and the gas eventually forms into this very nice single piece of graphene. And of course, that's not scalable.
if we wanted to use it in cement, right? And so to get, bulk graphene powders to use in composite applications or battery applications, people usually have to go from graphite, which is stacks of graphene, and then they have to, exfoliate or peel those sheets off one at a time. And so that's not scalable, that can be scalable, but we have to put a lot of energy in to pull those sheets apart. And so as we pull those sheets apart, we're damaging the sheets, which is not great because then we have a lower quality product. And then also to peel those sheets apart, usually we have to use surfactants or a lot of solvent or sonication, things like that. So those can be really energy intensive or resource intensive. And so Flash-Joule heating, the fact that we could make it without a catalyst and without, a solvent, and we also got much higher qualities of sheets because we don't have to, exfoliate them like from graphite. So we got better quality graphene at lower cost, really, and higher scalability since we're not using solvents, we're not using surfactants, we're not using sonication. So it was really a game changer. People have wanted to use graphene in a lot of applications. It's kind of like carbon fiber. It's very strong. People use it in race cars all the time, or things like that. These high-end applications. World champion tennis players use carbon fiber in their rackets and things like that because it's light and it's strong. But the everyday person doesn't really interact with carbon fiber because it's too expensive. So that's kind of the analogy I usually use when talking about graphene. Like, oh, have you heard of carbon fiber? And they're like, oh yeah, it's like super light, super strong. Yeah, like graphene is that kind of on steroids, where it's even lighter, even stronger, things like that. And so people have wanted to use it in a lot of applications. And actually Ford Motor Company was one of the first users of graphene on an industrial scale. In 2019, they started putting it in some of their plastics in the cars. So I tell people graphene could be in your driveway right now if you have a late model Ford car. And so they were really one of the first users to even use it on an industrial scale because of the cost and because of the scalability issues.
You mentioned that you had a collaboration with Ford, correct?
Yeah. And so once we kind of published the Flash-Joule heating formation of graphene, people in their R&D department saw it and were like, wow, this is kind of a game changer. We can make graphene for cheaper. And if we're already using graphene, then, hey, let's cut production costs.
Why not?
And so
yeah.
They collaborated with us. And that's actually who we teamed up with to write that bottle grant, which didn't end up getting funded, but it's fine. And we still did the work together, even though we didn't get funded. So I guess, whatever.
It worked out.
We made graphene out of end-of-life vehicle waste plastic. So there was a new law passed in the EU in Europe called the End-of-Life Vehicle Waste Plastic Act, really. And so as these cars come to the end of the life, usually they go to a landfill, and then they take the battery and fluids out, and then they pass it through the crusher, right, or the shredder. And so then the metals are pretty valuable, so they usually just magnetically remove those. And then everything else, the seat foam, the leather on the dash or steering wheel, you have all these different types of plastics, polycarbonate, ABS, PVC, even some glass still mixed in there. That usually just gets landfilled, polyurethane foams, things like that. It's not really valuable enough it's hard to recycle a lot of polyesters, and then it's not really worth value either. So that usually just gets landfilled. And, as people try to increase the fuel efficiency of cars, use less metal and use more plastic since it's lighter. And so now cars, each car could have, hundreds of kilograms of plastic, which at the end of the life just gets landfilled. And so in the EU, they passed a law saying that, by, I forget the year, they want 95% of the car to be recycled. And so all the car manufacturers are saying, well, shoot, what are we going to do with all this plastic? And so we had published a paper showing we could actually convert plastic and mixed waste plastics into graphene. And so they reached out and they were like, well, can you do it with car plastic? And we're like, probably, right? And so they sent us a bunch of plastic, and it looked like it was straight from a landfill. It had some dirt on it and stuff like that. It was these big pieces. I was like, okay. So I, ground them up into smaller pieces and then converted it into graphene, characterized it, kind of scaled it up a little bit, designed kind of a new heater reactor, and then, sent them close to 15 grams of graphene that they could then test and compare directly to the graphene that they had been using in their most recent cars. So they said, wow, this graphene actually works better than the graphene we've been using. and it's made from old Ford F-150s or whatever. So you kind of
That's
get that circularity there also.
Yeah. How good did that feel to get that sort of feedback?
Yeah, it really did feel great. So it was nice to kind of, make the material, characterize it. They were the ones that were testing it, kind of industrially. And it was great to have an industrial collaboration also, meet some of them and work with them, learn about the work they do and how it kind of differs from academic. But probably my favorite part of that project was we did what's called a life cycle assessment. And so these are becoming more kind of important in chemical engineering, polymer chemistry, things like that. What a life cycle assessment is if I wanted to compare a gas car to an electric car, and everyone says, oh, the electric car is more green, right? It has less emissions, it's more efficient. And then some people say, yeah, but making the battery is more complicated. You have to go mine all the elements and make the battery. And so what a life cycle assessment is, we're able to compare these two things. We look at from what's called the cradle, where we are getting all the starting materials we need for whatever product, whether it's an electric car battery or the combustion engine, getting the oil out of the ground. So we look at all the components needed to have our car drive, say, 100 miles. We need to make our car and have it drive however many miles. And so we can look at every step of the process, from getting the raw materials we need to assembling the battery or making the car or fueling up the car. And so we can see, the greenhouse gas emissions from the fuel car, the gas car, is more or less, or we have to drive this many miles in the electric car to break even, or things like that. People do these life cycle assessments for a lot of industrial processes to see how can we make this process greener, because if you're going through benchmarking and every step of the process, you can see which step is the most, has the highest burden of energy or emissions. And so I wanted to, we kept saying that, our process is so efficient and green. Our Flash-Joule heating process is so efficient and green because it doesn't use any solvent or sonication or catalysts. So I went ahead and did a life cycle assessment where we compared, what if we make 1 kilogram of our graphene from waste plastic and compare it to 1 kilogram of commercial graphene? We have the same product at the end, but we have all these different inputs for the two different processes. So we look at, the inputs for each process, the methods for each process, how much energy does it take to sonicate? How much energy or greenhouse gases are made to get the required solvent or surfactant, or how much energy do we use during our Flash-Joule heating process? And so we can add up all those and kind of, for 1 kilogram of graphene from commercial sources, it uses this much energy and greenhouse gases and water. And then our process ended up saving about 80% in energy, 80% in greenhouse gas emissions, and then up to 95% less water than commercial processes. So that was a technique that I had read about in literature, and the Ford's sustainability department kind of helped me conduct our own life cycle assessment. And so now we use that technique a lot in our group to compare our products, was our method better than commercial methods at making whatever product. So we included that in that same paper to show not only can we convert these waste plastics into this high value graphene, which has real world applicability in composites, but we can do it more energy efficiently and green sustainably than commercial methods. So it was really kind of a nice story in polymer upcycling and sustainability and things like that. So
you're talking right now the upcycling of waste plastics. And I've also, in some of the documents you sent me, it looked like there was a upcycling from a different source of polymer waste. Is this right, where there's the pyrolysis recycling process of plastics? So instead of just waste plastics, there's waste product from the recycling process. You're taking that waste product and turning it into graphene.
Yeah.
So is that awesome? So tell us first a little bit about how this recycling process works. What is pyrolysis, and how do you end up with this ash waste?
Yeah, so pyrolysis is one of the kind of major chemical recycling processes. So we have two types of recycling for plastics usually. Mechanical recycling, where we, melt down our bottles and convert it into something that, another plastic that usually it's a little lower quality since it's gone through that grinding and melting down process. You might have some contaminants in there, so usually it has to be washed a lot and then melted down and then repelletized into whatever recycled polymer that can then be reused. you end up usually with a lower value, lower quality product when you do that mechanical recycling, melting it back down. And so usually it's also because you use a bunch of water and you have to manually sort and separate your different types of plastics. It's a pretty expensive, time-intensive, resource-intensive process. And usually, depending on oil prices, it's usually cheaper to just make new plastic from oil rather than to go through all those steps. And so that's why, even though we've had the technology for decades, a lot of plastic still ends up in the landfill because it's just not economically viable to recycle it. And so that's mechanical recycling. Chemical recycling, on the other hand, is when we can kind of break down our plastics back into those molecules, building blocks that made our polymers in the first place. So with pyrolysis, all we're doing is we're heating our plastics. Like, let's take polyethylene. We put our Walmart bag in there, and then usually we heat it under an inert atmosphere. Sometimes we include a metal catalyst in there. And so what's happening in that we heat it up to 500 degrees Celsius. So that bond between our polymer and our polymer backbone and our polyethylene is going through what's called bond homolysis, or basically our bond is breaking in half. And so as our bond breaks in half, we are cracking it into these smaller compounds, which can have value. Instead of getting oil out of the ground, now we're getting our building blocks for new polymers from our old polymers, right? It's still a pretty expensive process since you have to heat it. You have to sometimes use catalysts, inert gases, things like that. You generally still have to separate the streams. Sometimes you don't have to wash them, which is nice. But you do get kind of those oils, which are the same as, the oils we get out of the ground. And so instead of, recycling it into a lower value product, you get something that has the same quality and value. But in pyrolysis, you're usually left with about this 20% weight, 10 to 20% of the mass of plastic you put in, you get out as this kind of char, ash. And so people are like, this really has no value, so we don't really know what to do with it. Sometimes if it's clean enough, then people can use it as kind of like a soil additive. Other people just kind of throw it out. But if we want to use chemical recycling, this pyrolysis process on a large scale, we're going to have tons and tons of this ash, which no one really knows what to do with. And so I said, hey, it's mostly carbon, probably pretty conductive. Why don't we Flash-Joule heat it? And so we could Flash-Joule heat it and convert that waste product that no one really knows what to do with into really nice graphene. And so now you have this value-added side product, right? You have something that's really valuable. And graphene, I've said it's really valuable, but it's about $100,000 per ton. So incredibly
$100,000 per ton.
Yeah.
Wow.
So $100 a kilogram, really. And that's kind of at scale. And so if we're making this value added side product, then that can, if we sell that graphene, then suddenly our chemical recycling pyrolysis plant has some economic viability, right? It has some incentive for people to do this process. And, capitalism, we just need some money putting in or coming out to make people want to do it. And so that was kind of my whole angle was if we're making this value added side product, then people might actually start making these pyrolysis plants once they know what to do with the ash, and it's another valuable side product for them.
So what is it again about graphene that makes it this super strong material, right? Like going back to your example of putting 0.1 weight percent in a sample of cement gave a 35% increase in the compression strength. So why is graphene able to do that? And also another question added to that, how is the graphene incorporated into a composite material like that, right? Is it, one big sheet? Is it ground up? How do you do that?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And so starting with that first part, why is it such kind of a great material? So if we think about, because it's one sheet thick and it has that wide network, that honeycomb lattice of carbon-carbon bonds. So if we compare that to a polymer, that'd be like a string, right? Whereas a sheet of graphene is like a net. And so when you pull on the net, it's a lot harder to break it than when you pull on just a string, right? You're kind of applying that force over a large area. And because it's just one atom thick, when we add 1 gram of graphene, we're adding, billions of sheets. Usually we might use a little bit of sonication or surfactant or shear mixing to disperse that graphene in whatever we're making, whether that's cement, polymers, coatings. We've used it in, Ford used it in polyurethane. We've shown it in epoxy, vinyl esters. So we've used our graphene in a ton of applications, and usually we'll just do some shear mixing, basically a blender, to kind of disperse that graphene into whatever our feedstock is. For our epoxy, we'll disperse it and then add our setting agent, and then we have a nice graphene composite. And so it's pretty easy to apply. It takes a lot of trial and error to kind of fine tune the parameters. How long do I want to blend it until it's mixed? How much is the optimal loading? And so when we have those single sheets of graphene, and our graphene and most commercial graphenes are maybe a few microns in size, the sheets, so pretty small. You can't see it with your bare eye. And so we have all those graphene sheets floating around, kind of bridging, like when you have a polymer fail under compression, especially, usually you get a crack that propagates, and then you get failure, right? And so if you have your crack forming and then it hits a sheet of graphene, that graphene is then dispersing the force over a large area. So instead of the crack propagating, then we have that graphene sheet basically acting as a reinforcement, a Band-Aid, kind of holding our material together. And so if we have billions of sheets of graphene in our, small little puck of cement, then you can see how kind of dispersing that force over a much larger area can really be result in a really great increase in compressive and tensile strength. So that's kind of the mechanism of how we exfoliate it and why graphene is so great in especially composites.
Yeah, well said. I think that was very well explained. Thank you. So, and how about its conductivity? Where do these incredible conductive properties come from?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so whenever we have if we think about a metal that's conductive, we have those electrons in our metal that form our conduction band, right? So when we have those free floating sea of electrons is what we think of when we think of a metal bond. And so we have all those extra electrons that can float around from end to end and conduct our charge across a wire, for example. When we have graphene, we have our aromatic sp2 hybridization. And so the entire sheet is connected by our sp2 hybridization. So if we think about using our aromaticity, what I was looking for, our aromaticity can carry our electron all the way across our sheet, much like a metal. So it doesn't really have a band gap, which is a fancy way of saying that it's very conductive, and our material can really conduct electrons from one end of the sheet to the other, just like a metal can, really. So
how does the conductivity of graphene compare to a copper wire?
I will have to look that up, actually. So with graphene, because it is usually one atom thick, if we have a hole or defects in our sheet, then that can hurt the conductivity. So a lot of times it'll depend on kind of the quality of the graphene. But if we have really high quality graphene, then it can actually be 70% higher than that of copper, is what the internet says. So
okay, awesome.
So that would be if that type of the really large single sheets that we make that people are thinking of using in electronics. LG is really looking into it. Samsung is really looking into, can we use graphene instead of whatever indium tin oxide or, whatever thick layer, conductive layer we want to use, because we want it to be transparent. Usually if we're thinking about a screen application, then we need a touch screen, for example. We need something that can conduct electricity all the way across it, but be transparent. And so really high quality graphene can be very conductive, and a few sheets of graphene we can see through.
Incredible. That's awesome. What's next for you, Kevin? Right? I think I saw you're done around September.
Yeah. So I'm trying to set my defense date now. I'm hoping for August.
Sure.
And so I'm starting to look at industry positions. I'm not super in love with academia. It just seems like there's always one task after another. You move to do a postdoc, and then you move for a faculty position, and then you fight for tenure, and then you fight for students, and then you fight for grant funding.
Yeah.
And so I'm really looking at industry for now. I might, after a few years in industry, look more towards national labs. I really liked my time there, and they have a lot of resources, and they work on some really exciting problems. There's a few. Oak Ridge National Lab does some nanomaterial work. Lawrence Livermore does some nanomaterials. There's one in Boulder, Colorado, which works pretty much on renewable energy and sustainability. But right now I'm looking at industry positions. Houston has a bunch of oil and gas. And so because of kind of recent climate issues and policy, government policy, a lot of oil and gas companies are really starting and kind of finally making these sustainability pushes, whether it's in advanced recycling or the use of nanomaterials or alternate pathways that we can make these same materials, but in a more sustainable manner. Hydrogen production, energy storage. So I think I'm kind of in the job market at a really nice time because, they might have started trying to look at these sustainability thrusts 2-3 years ago, and now they're finally kind of hiring for those roles or starting those departments and things like that. So, I kind of had this idea like, oh, I'm not going to work for oil and gas because I need to, the climate, right? And so
they seem like the bad guy.
You can really do a lot of really exciting research from the interviews that I've been doing and things like that. They're really doing a lot of these sustainability pushes and kind of putting it into action and really doing the R&D work and the scalability work and things like that.
Sure.
So,
you're going to be a hot commodity candidate, sir. It's really cool. And I think everyone, hopefully after listening to this, will be looking forward to you putting your work into these industries because you're doing things for the betterment of our world, right? And the health of our planet. So I appreciate it. I hope everyone who's listening appreciates it, man. It's really great to hear about what you're doing. Yeah, man. So I have one more question.
Yeah.
Is there anything we haven't talked about yet that you want to touch on before we finish this up?
Let's see. I really wanted to touch on life cycle assessment because I think it's a tool that industry is leaning more towards. I think chemical engineers have known about it for a while, but I think really, and even organic chemists have thought about it in terms of atom economy, right? I don't know if you're familiar with that term, but if
I'm not,
we're in pharmaceuticals, then how many steps do I need? How much solvent do I need to do these transformations? Can I make it? And that's almost a life cycle assessment right there. But I think that and when I read a lot of sustainability work, especially in upcycling or, we made this value added product from plastic, just like we're doing. But, we use this really expensive catalyst and a lot of solvent and all this. But hey, look, so if you use this life cycle assessment or this, step-by-step thinking of each, how green is each step, how resource intensive is each step of my process, then if you use that in the lab, then you're going to get out methods that are more scalable, more industrially relevant. Because if I'm using a platinum catalyst to make ethane, it's like, no one's ever going to use that because we can just get ethane from oil and gas, right? With much cheaper than using whatever platinum catalyst or very high temperatures or very low scalability. And so, for example, hydrogen energy has been kind of struggling with this for a while, right? We know that we can make hydrogen, which is this clean burning fuel source. We can make it from water just using, water electrolysis. We have H2O, we can pull off the hydrogen and get the oxygen, and then we make H2 and O2 and everything's great. But we have to do that process using a lot of electricity and these really expensive catalysts. So I've been working on using Flash-Joule heating to actually get hydrogen out of polymers. We end up getting basically H2 and graphene in an ideal system. And so we're not producing CO2. We're not using catalysts. So that's my last work that I've been working on. But when for example, hydrogen energy, we can make it by that water electrolysis. We're not making any CO2. It's great. We're converting water into hydrogen, and then we burn the hydrogen and we get water back. Like, no CO2. It's perfect, right? But more than 97% of the hydrogen that we use, whether it's for ammonia synthesis or hydrocarbon refining or even fuel cell vehicles, 97% of that comes from methane, basically. And we strip the hydrogen off the methane through a process called steam methane reforming, and you end up with CO2 and hydrogen. So you're still, for every 1 kilogram of hydrogen you get like 11 kilograms of CO2. And that's how the world is making its hydrogen right now, this supposedly clean fuel source. It's clean when you burn it, the hydrogen, but to make the hydrogen, we're making all this CO2. And that's just because the water electrolysis, green hydrogen, which doesn't produce any CO2, can't compete economically, right? Because we use these expensive catalysts, we use these expensive membranes, whereas, methane and steam very cheap, right? So it kind of, that's what I've realized in my PhD, is that if you want something to maybe change the world, you need to think about the process in terms of money through, kind of a techno-economic analysis would be kind of the word there. How much cost inputs and outputs do I have? If I'm making a valuable graphene product, that's great. Or if I'm using an expensive catalyst, that's bad. And then also that life cycle assessment, where we can look at each step of the way. And the National Renewable Energy Lab, NREL, has a great system for life cycle assessment called GREET, which is free. There's also some, LCA systems that cost money, but if you can convince your PI to do it, a lot of papers are starting to include it, and I'm really glad that our lab adopted this strategy, because it lets you look at the process, and help you change it. For example, when I was doing the Ford research, because plastics are insulating, right? We can't pass current through it for our Flash-Joule heating stuff. So we have to add a little bit of some conductive carbon, whether that's charcoal or carbon black or whatever. So I was using carbon black. And through my life cycle assessment and economic analysis, I said, wow, the most expensive part of this whole process is that 8 weight % carbon black that I have to add. And so that let me look at, are there cheaper conductive additives that I can add that are, they're cheaper or they're easier to make, less energy intensive to make. And so I ended up at a coal product, which was way cheaper and way, greener when we think about making all the starting materials we need. So this type of thinking can help ease the transition of processes and new discoveries from, invention and lab scale use to maybe eventually industrial use. Because that's where a lot of startups and ideas kind of fall through the cracks is, some company is interested in it, and then they sit down and look at the process and they say, oh, wow, we need a lot of catalyst and a lot of solvent, and we don't get a very valuable product, and all right, this isn't going to work. So if you're thinking about that while you're making the process and designing the method, then, it's going to be a more efficient process, a cheaper process, and have a higher likelihood of, eventually going into a startup or something like that.
If someone wanted to employ this tactic for their first time, whether in a research group at school or something, you mentioned you had help from Ford company to help get that done. Let's say they don't have that connection. How do you start? Would I just get on Google and type lifetime assessment? Life cycle, was it?
Yep. And so NREL and I don't remember if it was the DOE. They made like a whole little video series about it, YouTube videos. I'll find it and send it.
Yeah, I was going to say, if you can find it, send me the link and I'll put that in the show notes.
Yeah, but there's some literature reviews out there. And a lot of times it depends on what your product is. Like, for example, if I'm making a material product, like a polymer, pretty easy, right? I just look at what I put in for each step, and then I, look at my outputs. And it really, if you can find a life cycle assessment, like for hydrogen, if I wanted to find a life cycle assessment for hydrogen that people have already done, I can look at that and then compare it to my new process and take a lot of those same type of numbers, and then wherever I tweak it, or the graphene one. So looking at an already done life cycle assessment can kind of show you the framework. But NREL, they have a big database, and they were one of the first kind of government entities that I think were pioneering this more than a decade ago, because they've always been thinking about renewable energy and things like that. And how can we compare how green solar panels are versus how green windmills are, right? And things like that. And so they do some really cool life cycle assessments. But I will find some resources, and I'll send them to Jacob, and he can include it here, because I think it is really starting to come more into focus in the industrial, and then even in the academic, you'll see papers published in journals like Green Chemistry or ACS Sustainability. Some pretty high impact journals that really have these life cycle assessments attached to them to help drive the point home and compare processes and things like that. So.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you for adding on to that. I appreciate it. That sounds pretty exciting and useful for a lot of people that hopefully will employ this after listening. So, Kevin, that's all I got. Thank you so much for reaching out to me and for talking to me today. This has been an awesome time, and I know I'm going to have a good time editing this one.
Yeah, and thank you so much for having me on and really doing this SciComm for grad students and undergrads and the greater public. It's really important to convey the work that we do and how it impacts the public and build that trust and that rapport, and be able to talk about your science and an accessible way, and it's easy to understand, and people can see that, oh, all this taxpayer money that goes to the grants is actually, maybe doing something useful. So thanks for having me on and really doing this whole podcast thing.
Thanks, man. I really appreciate you being on the show. And thank you to all of our wonderful, wonderful Polymer Science Podcast listeners. Really, I can't express how much I appreciate you listening to this show. It just means so much to us. We are excited to be back, and I promise it won't take nearly as long to record another episode. I've got several interviews waiting to be edited and uploaded, so we'll be back at our, at the very least, 1 episode per month rate. And who knows, there's still plenty of future for the Polymer Science Podcast and plenty of room for growth. And you can help be a part of that growth. If you have any questions, feedback, or comments, or if you just want to say hello to Dr. Buetes and I, maybe you want to be on the show, then we encourage you to reach out to us at PolymerSciencePodcast@gmail.com. I hope you've enjoyed this episode, and we'll see you next time.